Good evening and welcome back. Let the world go quiet around you. Tonight, we're sinking gently into the oldest story the Western world has ever whispered, a tale born before temples, before kings, before the first human ever opened their eyes. Long before Olympus rose, long before the earth took shape, there was only one thing: chaos. Not the noisy kind, the everyday confusion people complain about now. This chaos was older, deeper, a silent, endless nothing. It was a cold breath of space that stretched without memory or meaning. It wasn't good or bad, it wasn't violent, it simply existed alone. And then, in a moment no one can describe, something stirred inside that endless dark, a soft pulse, a quiet thrum, the very first hint of creation. From that pulse came Gaia, the earth solid, heavy, calm. She rose like a steady heartbeat, wide and unmoving beneath the emptiness. Then came Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath her, a shadow so heavy it seemed to swallow sound. And with them appeared Eros, the first spark of desire, the force that would pull all things together, the gentle gravity behind every future story of life. More shapes followed. Nyx, the night wrapped in darkness so thick it felt alive. And Erebus, the shadow that lingered beneath all shadows. Together they were quiet companions wandering through the newborn world before light existed. From them came Etha, the bright upper air, and Hemera, the day, whose soft glow would someday sweep across the sky. Mother and daughter moving in a slow, endless chase, night fading into day, day rolling back into night, a rhythm older than any sun. Gaia, patient and powerful, did not rest. From her own vast body she formed Uranus, the sky, a great shimmering ceiling filled with early stars that barely knew how to shine. He was both her child and her companion, and when he stretched himself over her, the world finally had its first shape. Earth below, sky above, the two locked together in a quiet embrace. Mountains rose from Gaia's body like sleeping giants, and the sea Pontus swelled with its own restless mind, rolling long before waves ever carried ships or monsters. And together, Gaia and Uranus created the first rulers of the cosmos. The Titans, 12 immense beings carved from the raw materials of the universe. They were not yet the gods people would one day worship, but they were old, deep, and powerful. Oceanus, who circled the world like a living river. Hyperion, bright as the first sunrise. Coeus, seeker of knowledge. Creus, the anchor of the constellations. Iapetus, father of humankind. And Cronus, the youngest, quiet, sharp, and patient. Their sisters were just as mighty: Theia, who gave light to sun and moon; Rhea, gentle and wise; Themis, born from justice itself; Mnemosyne, keeper of memory; Phoebe, glowing with cold brilliance; and Tethys, mother of rivers and streams. But Gaia's womb did not stop with beauty. She carried deeper, older lives, creatures born from the raw edges of creation itself. The Cyclopes came first. Bronze, Steropes, and Arges, each with a single burning eye and hands strong enough to shape thunder. They were fearless, simple, and loyal. Then the Hecatoncheires rose, beings so huge that even chaos seemed to pull back from them. The 50 heads, 100 arms, voices like breaking storms. These were Gaia's children too. She loved them all, but Uranus did not. The sky looked upon the monsters with fear. Their size, their strength, their wildness shook him. And fear, even in the beginning of the world, can twist a heart. So he forced them back into Gaia's depths, crushing them into her body, burying them beneath layer after layer of stone. Their screams echoed inside her like earthquakes. And Gaia, heavy with pain, could no longer bear it. Night after night, Uranus pressed down upon her, his weight sealing her children inside her belly. never hearing her cries or feeling her trembling grief. Gaia, who shaped mountains and seas, began to grow bitter. And bitterness in the ancient world did not sit quietly. From her own body she carved a blade, not metal, not anything human hands have ever touched, but raw flint, sharp as betrayal and cold as truth. She called her sons. She told them what the sky had done. One by one they lowered their eyes, frightened of Uranus, until only one remained, Cronus, the quiet one, the careful one, the one who watched when others did not. And he reached for the blade. That night Uranus descended again unaware. The sky lay over the earth and Cronus struck. The world shook, stars shivered. The first drop of divine blood fell. And Cronus cut his father down and cast the severed pieces into the sea. From the white foam that gathered on the waves, a shape rose, soft, radiant, impossible. Aphrodite. Love walked out of violence, stepping onto the shores of Cyprus as gently as a tide. Beautiful enough to destroy cities. Calm enough to start wars with a sigh. But the blood that splattered upon Gaia did not stay quiet. From each drop grew the Furies, dark-winged spirits who hunted oath-breakers. The giants born for future war, and the Melii, nymphs of the ash trees who guarded old forests. Uranus fled into the heavens, broken and furious. But before disappearing entirely, he gasped out a final curse. As I was overthrown by my son, so shall he be overthrown by his. Cronus heard every word. He climbed onto the throne of the sky and took Rhea as his queen. Together they ruled an age poets later called the Golden Age, a peaceful time when humans lived without hunger, cold, or fear. No one locked a door, no one carried a sword, the earth gave freely. The world felt safe. But inside Cronus, fear worked like a slow poison. Rhea soon bore children: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. And each time a newborn warmed her arms and she placed that child in Cronus's hands, his father's curse rang in his skull like a bell. So he swallowed them whole, one by one, without hesitation, without mercy. No cradle songs, no childhood laughs, just silence swallowed into his belly like stones. Rhea, powerful as she was, could not stop him. She wept, she begged, she pleaded, but fear is a hard god to argue with. Finally, carrying her sixth child, she ran. She climbed into the mountains of Crete, hid beneath a cave, and brought Zeus into the world under the watch of nymphs and shepherds. The moment he cried, the trees trembled. His tiny fist curled around her finger like he had known strength forever. Rhea wrapped a stone in soft cloth and gave it to Cronus as if it were the child. He swallowed it without a thought. And the real infant Zeus was hidden beneath Mount Ida, guarded by warriors who clashed their shields to cover the sound of his growing voice. Milk from the goat Amalthea strengthened him, and every day he grew not just in size but in something heavier, older, a destiny gathering like a storm on the horizon. Cronus still ruled. The Golden Age still shone. But somewhere inside the quiet cave, a boy was growing into the thunder that would shatter the world. The sky stretched tall and blue above the newborn world, and the earth below glowed with a young, steady green. From their high thrones, the Titans ruled without fear, believing their reign would last forever. But deep inside Cronus, 5 swallowed children stirred like distant thunder, forgotten by their father, yet very much alive. And far in the western mountains, hidden beneath layers of rock and secrecy, another child watched the stars and waited for his moment. High in the rugged folds of Mount Ida, where pines sighed in the thin air and shadows whispered names older than time, Zeus grew in silence and in strength. He learned not from scrolls or tutors, but from the mountain winds, from the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, and from the hushed stories of the nymphs who protected him. He drank the milk of Amalthea, the divine goat who had fed him since the moment of his birth. And when her horn was broken, no one ever agreed whether it was an accident or a sign. The first cornucopia was born, the horn that could pour out endless nourishment. When Amalthea died, Zeus hung her hide among the stars. One day he would command the heavens, but her light would shine there long before he ever lifted a thunderbolt. But Zeus was not raised for peace or quiet. Rebellion moved inside him like a fire. Prophecy lived in his bones. And Gaia, the earth herself, felt that fire awakening. She remembered her own suffering, the betrayal of Cronus, and the agony of her imprisoned sons buried deep in Tartarus. Her anger had never really faded. She was simply waiting for the right hands to finish what she had started. She began to whisper into Zeus's dreams, voices that felt like shifting soil, moving roots, and murmuring stone. And when he woke, he felt the pull of destiny guiding his every step. Gaia led him first to Medes, the Titaness of wisdom. She was sharp-minded, patient, and loyal to the future rather than the past. With her guidance, Zeus built a plan, not the plan of a warrior, but of someone willing to reshape a world. To defeat Cronus, strength alone was nothing. Cunning would be the blade. So Zeus wrapped himself in disguise and traveled straight into his father's home. Medes had prepared a potion, bitter, heavy, sweet like thick honey, designed to twist Cronus's stomach and force out the children he had swallowed. And Cronus drank, a tremor shook his body. His jaw cracked open, and with a roar that rolled across the mountains, the swallowed gods returned to the world, Hestia glowing with hearth fire, Demeter green with the breath of harvests, Hera proud and cold-eyed, Hades dark and silent, Poseidon crowned in salt and storm. They emerged not as infants but fully grown, gods already forged in the darkness they'd endured. For the first time, the six siblings stood together, united. And they did not forget what Cronus had done. But Cronus had allies of his own. Across the south, the Titans rallied atop Mount Othrys, Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, old powers hardened by age and pride. Only Oceanus stayed away, whether from wisdom or exhaustion no one could say. And so began the great war, the Titanomachy. A war that tore across heaven and earth, a war so vast even mountains trembled. For 10 long years the world shook. Storm clouds choked the sky. Lightning cracked open the heavens. Oceans surged high enough to swallow islands. Winds howled like wolves through the valleys. Volcanoes bled rivers of fire. Neither side could win. Neither side could fall, until Gaia whispered again. If Zeus wanted victory, he would need the beings Cronus feared most, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones. So Zeus and his siblings descended into Tartarus itself. They shattered the gates, chains broke, darkness shuddered, and the ancient prisoners rose, furious and eager for revenge. The Cyclopes, grateful to Zeus, forged mighty gifts, the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure storm. The trident, a spear of the deep. The helm of darkness, a crown of invisibility. The 100-handed ones joined them too, hurling mountains like pebbles and smashing Titan lines with unrestrained rage. The war's balance broke. The Olympians surged forward. Cronus fought with the desperation of one trying to stop destiny with his bare hands, but prophecies do not bend, they break what stands against them. One by one the Titans fell. Zeus did not kill them. He cast them into Tartarus, sealing them away behind bronze gates that would never decay. Only 3 escaped punishment: Prometheus, who saw the future; Epimetheus, who remembered the past; and Themis, who knew justice when she saw it. The world grew quiet again, scarred, trembling, but alive, and Zeus rose, not because he was eldest, not because he desired the throne, but because fate, might, and timing all pointed to him. Yet even with victory won, Cronus's last curse still clung to him like a shadow. For no throne in the cosmos is ever safe, not for mortals, not for gods. When the dust settled, the gods faced the hardest task of all, ruling a world. Conquest burns hot and fast, but rule requires patience. The world was too enormous, too wild, too full of unclaimed power for one ruler to hold. And Zeus had two brothers who had fought beside him. Poseidon, loud as the surf and fierce as the storm. Hades, silent, steady, and untouched by fear. None could be ignored, so the three stood together. They cast sacred lots, letting fate choose what even gods would not argue over. The bones fell. Zeus won the sky, the blue vault, the storms, the thunder, the eagle soaring high above the world. Poseidon won the sea, the oceans, the tides, the creatures that lurked beneath black waves. Hades won the underworld, a quiet realm of shadows where he ruled with fairness and unwavering law. The earth itself remained shared, a middle ground where gods walked openly and mortals rose from dust to destiny. Olympus became their court, a bright, unreachable summit crowned in cloud. No roads, no walls, just clean air and divine presence. A place where no mortal storm dared climb. And there, gathering around Zeus, came the gods who would shape every future myth. Hera, sharp as winter. Demeter, gentle as spring. Hestia, warm as a home fire. Athena, born of wisdom. Apollo, golden and bright. Artemis, swift and silent. Ares, restless with battle. Hermes, clever as a spark. Hephaestus, steady as iron. And Aphrodite, whose beauty could collapse empires. A new age had begun, the age of Olympus. But peace, when placed in the hands of gods, is never a promise. It is only a pause, and the world, still young and shifting, was far from finished. Olympus rose above the world like a crown of stone wrapped in drifting cloud. Its halls shimmered, half marble, half mist, where starlight seeped through vaulted ceilings and long corridors stretched wide enough for the wind itself to wander freely. Here the gods did not hide behind storms or omens. Here they walked in their true shapes, radiant, terrible, and unmistakably alive. More alive than anything moving on the earth below. At the highest point of that divine mountain sat Zeus, king of gods and men, settled upon a throne carved from thunder. He did not rule through strength alone, though strength he had in endless supply, but through fate's quiet approval and the memory of the war that had carved the world anew. His voice traveled like distant thunder rolling across hills. His eyes pierced clouds and time with equal ease. And in his hand rested the thunderbolt, the Cyclops' gift, a weapon that judged swiftly and without mercy. But even Zeus did not reign alone. Around him stood the pillars of the new world, each a power in their own right. Hera sat beside him not just as his wife but as queen, a ruler forged in dignity, devotion, and wrath. She carried the weight of marriage, childbirth, and sovereignty, and inside her burned the quiet fury of a woman who never forgot a wound. Her jealousy would one day shift the fates of heroes and nations. Her crown was earned, not granted. Demeter stood nearby, steady and watchful. Wherever she walked, the soil breathed easier, seeds awakened, fields softened. Bounty followed her like a shadow. She visited the mortal world often, watching over farmers and mothers who whispered her name at sunrise. Calm, older than most, she carried a power the others rarely matched. Hestia remained at the heart of the mountain goddess of the hearth and firstborn of Cronus and Rhea. She asked for no temple, no war, no glory. She kept the eternal flame alive, a quiet warmth that lived in every home, every family's fire, every circle of safety. As long as fire burned on earth, Hestia watched over it. Then came the younger gods born not in chaos, but in a world beginning to shape itself. Athena was the first among them. Her birth came not from womb or labor, but from the strained mind of Zeus himself. When he swallowed Medes to escape her prophecy, he thought he had avoided danger. But wisdom cannot be buried. Inside his skull, Medes worked, whispering, forging, creating. One day Zeus staggered in agony. A crack split his forehead, and out stepped Athena, full-grown, clothed in bronze, spear in hand, with eyes sharper than winter air. She became the goddess of strategy and of wars fought with purpose, a warrior untouched by distraction or lust. Next came the twins, children of Leto, Apollo and Artemis. Leto wandered long before finding a place to give birth, chased and tormented by Hera's rage. No land dared shelter her until the floating island of Delos drifted beneath her feet. There, under a sky trembling between sun and shadow, she bore her children. Apollo, golden-haired, bright as the midday sun, lord of prophecy, music, healing, and truth. Artemis, silver, quiet, sharp as a drawn bow, goddess of the hunt, the wild, the moon. Together they brought a new kind of divinity, less distant, more woven into the rhythms of mortals. Then came Ares, god of war, born of Zeus and Hera, loved by neither. He was battle without reason, violence without restraint. He thrived on chaos, but often fell to those who fought with strategy rather than rage. His opposite was Hephaestus, the god of the forge. Lame, limping, thoughtful, born of Hera alone or thrown from Olympus by Zeus, no mortal would ever know for certain. He found solace in the glow of metal and fire. Or from his hands came armor fit for gods, palaces that breathed steam, and creations that blurred the line between magic and invention. Though his gait was uneven, his skill was unmatched. Then there was Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, desire, entanglements. She rose from the foam of the sea, born from the severed flesh of Uranus. She stepped onto the shores of Cyprus, radiant and dangerous, her presence bending hearts, oaths, and nations. Even Zeus tread carefully around her, for her power was subtle, soft, and devastating. Last of this early gathering came Hermes, son of Zeus and Maia, a trickster from the moment he opened his eyes. He stole Apollo's cattle the day he was born, sang a song to distract him, and made himself too useful to punish. Swift-footed, clever-tongued, Hermes became messenger of the gods, guide of the dead, patron of travelers, thieves, and crossroads. This was Olympus, not a kingdom of saints, but a storm of personalities, proud, flawed, radiant, unpredictable. They quarreled like siblings, played favorites among mortals, fell in love, tangled destinies, betrayed one another, and judged the world from their cloud-wrapped thrones. The age of Titans had fallen. A new era, loud, bright, and full of stories, had taken hold. But harmony, even among gods, is a fragile thing, and fate had more threads to weave. Before humans built cities of marble or carved prayers into stone, the world belonged only to gods, and the earth below was silent. No hearth fires, no songs, no human footsteps moving between fields and mountains. It was Prometheus, a titan who lived between worlds, who first imagined mankind. He had chosen Zeus during the war not out of loyalty but foresight. His gift was prophecy. He followed what he knew must happen, not what he desired. Prometheus, meaning forethought, was the opposite of his brother Epimetheus, whose name meant afterthought. One looked ahead, the other regretted behind. It was Prometheus who shaped the first humans. Some say he sculpted them from river clay. Others say he molded them in the image of the gods. However it happened, humans came into being soft-skinned, fragile, weaponless, cold beneath the stars. But Prometheus pitied them. He climbed Olympus and asked Zeus to let them have a gift, something small, something to help them survive. Zeus refused. He saw danger in mortals, he saw rebellion, he saw his own downfall. The fire, he declared, was divine alone. But Prometheus did not accept this. In secret, he crept into the forge of Hephaestus, stole a glowing coal, hid it inside a hollow fennel stalk, and carried it down the mountain. And with that single ember, humanity changed forever. Fire cracked and roared beneath the night sky. Heat spread, food cooked, tools were forged, language blossomed, hope grew. Zeus felt the insult instantly. As he struck back not at Prometheus but at mankind. He ordered the gods to create a woman, a gift wrapped in beauty and doom. Hephaestus shaped her from clay, Aphrodite gave her allure, Hermes gave her cunning. Athena clothed her in shining silver. Her name was Pandora, all-gifted. And she carried a sealed jar containing every sorrow of the world, disease, envy, toil, madness, grief, death. Prometheus warned his brother not to accept her, but Epimetheus, slow to think yet quick to desire, took her into his home. And Pandora opened the jar. The evils spilled into the world like black smoke, and humanity's quiet innocence was shattered. As only hope remained trapped inside, a faint light in the dark. Prometheus still had not been punished. Zeus finally turned his wrath on him. He ordered the Titan chained to a mountain at the edge of the world, bound in unbreakable chains, left to suffer beneath sun, wind, and storm. As each day an eagle descended to tear at his liver, each night it grew back. And the cycle repeated for ages, longer than kings rule, longer than cities stand, longer than mortals remember. But Prometheus endured. He knew a secret, the name of the child who would one day topple Zeus himself. That secret kept him alive. And as humans warmed themselves by fire, telling stories in the glow of the gift he stole, the gods above watched a world filling slowly with beauty, violence, and destiny. The world changed as ages drifted by, and the poets who lived long after these first stories would look back and swear that humanity had not been born once, but many times. Each creation, each fall, each rise carried its own shadow and its own blessing. Hesiod, the old farmer poet of Boeotia, was the first to give those ages names. He divided the long march of human existence into 5 chapters: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. Only one would shine brighter than the rest. Only one would stand as a memory of what humanity once was. The first was the Golden Age, born under the quiet rule of Cronus before fear touched Olympus, before war scarred the earth, before iron weighed down the hands of mortals. The people of this age lived like gods, untouched by grief or time. They knew no hunger, they labored for nothing. The earth bloomed for them without being asked, harvest after harvest, season after season. No kings ruled them. No swords divided them. No laws were needed because no cruelty lived in their hearts. And when their time came, they did not suffer, they did not wither, they simply drifted into death as if falling asleep. Their spirits roamed the world as gentle guardians, pure and kind, watching over justice in a world that did not yet know corruption. It was the closest mortals would ever come to paradise. But golden things do not last. With Cronus cast down and Zeus rising to power, the Silver Age dawned, brighter than the ages to come but dimmer than the one before. These mortals lived long, growing tall and strong, but their souls were less noble. They lingered in childhood for a century, spoiled and ignorant, only to grow into loud, arrogant adults. They honored no gods, built no temples, made no offerings. They lived without reverence and became the first reflection of divine fear. So Zeus struck them down. Their spirits did not rise as guardians but faded into the underworld, pale and forgotten. Next came the Bronze Age, born from the ash trees, the same trees that birthed spear shafts and shields. These mortals were not gentle. They were beings of war, their very flesh said to be made of bronze. Their tools, their homes, their weapons, all bronze. Their hearts felt forged from the same metal. They lived for battle, died by battle. They filled the world with blood and fire. They did not build cities. They did not carve poems or statues. They left only broken swords behind. Even the gods did not mourn them. But decline does not always move in a straight line. Out of the smoke and iron of violence rose one brilliant spark, the heroic age. This age was not a fall, but a shining pause before the descent continued. These mortals were unlike any before or after, born from the mingling of divine and human blood. Demigods, heroes, the boundary between mortal and immortal blurring like mist at dawn. This was the age of Perseus and Heracles, of Theseus and Atalanta, of Jason and the Argonauts, of Hector, Achilles, and Odysseus. They warred against monsters, against foreign kings, and finally against each other at Troy. They died young. They died violently. But their stories did not die with them. Some were granted a place beyond the western sea in the Isles of the Blessed, where mourning never fades and heroes walk forever in peace. The heroic age burned brief but brilliant, like a torch flaring against the dark. And then came the age in which Hesiod himself lived, the Iron Age where we too still dwell, a heavy age, a world worn down by time. Men rise early, sleep late, labor through wars and winters, grow old before their time, and carry more fear than hope. In this age, friendships crack, family ties break, and the sacred bond of guest and host fades. Injustice walks the earth with lowered eyes. Lies multiply, oaths crumble, and the gods, if they watch at all, watch quietly. Mortals build empires but forget the stories that built them. They chase wealth, cut forests, exhaust soil. It is an age of struggle, and someday even this age will end. Someday Zeus may cast down his final thunderbolt and humankind will vanish like smoke. And yet the Iron Age endures. People still build, still dream. Still tell stories of a time when mortals were golden and gods walked the earth. And perhaps that hope, fragile, trembling, is the one gift Pandora left behind. Between the fading age of gods and the rising age of men, there came a generation unlike the rest, mortals shaped from both Olympus and earth. These were the first heroes. Their lives were short, their fates cruel, but their names were thunder echoing across centuries, and among the first of them stood Perseus. His legend began not with sword and shield, but with fear, prophecy, and a king desperate to outmaneuver fate. Perseus's mother, Danae, was a princess of Argos, daughter of King Achilles, a man ruled more by fear than love. An oracle had warned him that Danae would bear a son who would kill him. Prophecies in myth are not bargains. They are truths waiting for their hour. Achilles tried to escape his fate. He sealed Danae in a bronze chamber beneath the earth, a prison no man could enter. But the gods do not honor mortal locks. Zeus slipped into her chamber as golden rain, falling through cracks no wall could seal. From that shimmering visitation, Perseus was conceived. When Achilles found the child, he dared not commit murder. Even tyrants fear divine punishment. So he chose the sea to do his killing. He placed Danae and infant Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them adrift on the waves. But the sea has moods of its own. Instead of drowning, the chest drifted to the island of Seriphos, where the fisherman Dictys found it and raised Perseus as his own. Years passed, and the boy grew tall with the calmness of the sea and the sharp gaze of his father. But destiny has a way of circling back. The ruler of Seriphos, King Polydex, desired Danae. Perseus stood against him, a young man facing a king with nothing but his resolve. So Polydex schemed. He declared a false wedding feast and demanded each man bring a gift. Perseus had nothing to offer. So he spoke boldly, and fate listened. "I will bring you a greater gift, the head of Medusa." Medusa, the mortal Gorgon, whose gaze turned living flesh to stone, Polydex smiled. He expected never to see the boy again. But the gods had taken an interest in Perseus. Athena, whose temple Medusa had once been defiled in, gave him a polished shield bright enough to reflect a monster safely. Hermes gave him winged sandals and a blade curved for divine work, and guided him toward the Gria, the three gray sisters who shared one eye and knew secrets no map recorded. Perseus stole their eye, demanding directions to the sacred nymphs, keepers of the tools he would need. They gave him the helm of Hades, which cloaked him in darkness, the kibices, the magical sack to contain the Gorgon's head, and the path to the edge of the world where daylight never touched the stones. There, in a silent grove surrounded by statues of the doomed, the Gorgons slept. Perseus did not dare look at Medusa directly. He approached with Athena's shield reflecting her form, walking backward, step by careful step. With a single swift strike, he severed her head. From her blood rose Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the golden warrior, children of Poseidon, born at the moment of her death. Her immortal sisters screamed, tearing through the grove, but Perseus vanished beneath the helm of darkness. His journey home wound long and dangerous. At the shores of Ethiopia, he found Princess Andromeda chained to a rock, offered to a sea monster as punishment for her mother's pride. Perseus saved her, some say with his sword, others say with Medusa's gaze, and claimed her as his bride. When he reached Seriphos, Polydex mocked his tales. So Perseus lifted Medusa's head and watched the king and his court turn to stone. Dictys became ruler in his place, but fate does not forget. Perseus traveled to Argos and Acrisius fled from the grandson he feared, yet destiny has patience. At a funeral game, Perseus threw a discus that struck an old man in the crowd, Acrisius. The prophecy unfolded not through hatred but through accident long foretold. The circle had closed. Perseus became a legend, slayer of monsters, savior of maidens, founder of lines that would stretch across ages. And from his blood would one day rise Heracles, a name that would shake both earth and heaven. If Perseus was the first bright flare of heroism, Heracles was the thunder that followed. His name rolled across the Greek world like distant storm sound, spoken in marketplaces, whispered at campfires, carried on the lips of soldiers and storytellers alike. He wasn't just strong. He felt bigger than the world that held him, 1 foot on the side of gods, 1 foot dragged through dust and sorrow. He was Perseus's great-grandson. He was a son of Argus. He was a son of Zeus. And from the beginning, his life was marked for greatness and for pain. His story began with a stretched night. Zeus, hungry for yet another mortal woman, set his eyes on Alcmene, wife of the Theban general Amphitryon. Taking Amphitryon's form, Zeus returned home to her, and what mortals would call one night, the king of the gods stretched into 3. From that encounter, Heracles was conceived. From Amphitryon came another son, Iphicles, fully mortal. The two boys, one made of ordinary flesh, one carrying lightning in his blood. Hera did not miss it. From her high seat she watched with cold, focused hatred. She knew Zeus's patterns. She knew how often his affairs gave rise to threats to her honor, to her place, to her children. This one she marked early. Even in his cradle, Heracles felt different. His hands were small, but they closed with unnatural strength. His breathing was calm, even as a baby. Hera sent two serpents into the nursery at night, their bodies curling over stone, their tongues tasting the warm air around the sleeping brothers. Iphicles screamed. The nurses rushed in expecting death. Instead, they found Heracles sitting upright in the straw, one snake in each fist, their bodies limp, their necks broken. From that moment, rumors about the child began to spread like brushfire. As he grew, Heracles was trained in all the arts expected of a nobleman: music, archery, wrestling, chariot driving. He learned how to strike a tune on the lyre and how to strike down an enemy in the dirt. But there was something inside him that training couldn't smooth out, a wildness, a restlessness like constant thunder building on a far horizon. Manhood brought him a brief taste of peace. He married Megara, daughter of King Creon of Thebes. As he had children, defended his city, and for a time it looked like his life might follow a simple human path. Hera did not allow it. She wrapped his mind in madness like a dark fog. Heracles, blinded by rage he didn't understand, rampaged through his own house. By the time the madness lifted, his wife and children lay dead at his feet, slain by his own hands. The silence that followed was heavier than any monster he would ever face. His cries rose all the way to Olympus. No god answered. Crushed by guilt, Heracles went to Delphi. The oracle's words were clear and unforgiving. If he wanted redemption, he had to submit himself to Eurystheus, king of Tiryns, a small man, a nervous man, but one who fate had placed above him. Only through long suffering and service could Heracles clean the blood from his soul. So began the 12 labors, tasks so harsh and impossible that even the gods leaned forward to watch. First came the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide couldn't be pierced by any blade. Heracles hunted it through hills and shadowed woods until he cornered it in its cave. His arrows bounced off its sides like pebbles against bronze. So he threw down his weapons, wrapped his arms around its neck, and squeezed until its life slipped away. He skinned it with one of its own claws and wore the pelt across his shoulders, a second, invincible skin. Next, he faced the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with many heads rising from a foul swamp. He cut off one head and two more grew back. Heracles waded into the stench and teeth, and beside him fought his nephew Iolaus. Each time Heracles severed a head, Iolaus burned the stump with fire, sealing it shut. The last head was immortal, its blood thick with venom. Heracles buried it under a rock, but kept the poison, dipping his arrows in it, making them lethal to almost anything mortal or divine. Third, he chased the Cyrenian hind, a golden-horned deer sacred to Artemis. For a full year he followed it over mountains, through rivers, across frost and dust, until finally he caught it gently without shedding blood. Even Artemis, cold and distant, reluctantly allowed him to bring it back alive. Fourth, he hunted the Erymanthian boar, a monstrous creature crashing through the snowbound forests of Arcadia. Heracles drove it into deep drifts, bound it, and dragged it back growling to Tiryns, while Eurystheus, terrified, hid inside a bronze jar. The fifth task seemed beneath a hero, cleaning the Augean stables. Thousands of cattle. Years of filth, No one had ever climbed them. Heracles didn't argue. Instead, he turned two rivers from their courses and let them rush through the stables, washing everything away in one day. The sixth labor. The Stymphalian birds, flesh-eating creatures with bronze beaks and metallic feathers sharp as razors. With a rattle given by Athena, Heracles frightened them into the air and shot them from the sky until the marsh grew quiet again. The seventh sent him to Crete to capture the Cretan bull, a beast with sea fire in its eyes, connected to the dark story that would later birth the Minotaur. Heracles wrestled it, forced it to submission, and led it back alive, snorting and wild as a storm. The eighth labor took him to Thrace, to the mares of Diome's horses that had learned to eat human flesh. Heracles turned their cruelty back on their master. He fed Diome's to his own mares. Once sated, the horses grew calm. The ninth task was tangled in politics and blood. He was sent to retrieve the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. At first, she agreed to give it freely, but Hera whispered among the warrior women, twisting their thoughts. Battle broke out. Hippolyta fell beneath Heracles' blade, and he left with the belt, carrying another quiet weight of regret. The 10th labor drove him to the edges of the known world, to the red island of Erythea, home of Geryon, the three-bodied giant. Heracles fought Geryon, his herdsman, and his hound in a storm of arrows and violence, then drove the giant's red cattle back across mountains and seas. At the narrow strait between lands, he raised two great markers, the pillars of Heracles, to say, "I came this far." Eurystheus, desperate to diminish him, ruled that the Hydra labor didn't count because Iolaus had helped and that the rivers had done the work at the stables. So two more tasks were added. The 11th labor. To steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by nymphs and a dragon coiled around the tree. Heracles sought out Atlas, who held the sky on his shoulders. He offered to bear the heavens for a while if Atlas would fetch the apples. Atlas gladly agreed, and when he returned with the golden fruit, he decided he would not resume his burden. Heracles nodded, pretending to agree, and asked only for a moment to adjust his cloak. Atlas took back the sky, and Heracles walked away with the apples. The 12th and final labor was the darkest of all. Descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. Heracles went down without weapon or armor, presented himself to Hades, and asked permission. Granted the chance, he grappled the beast with his bare hands, wrestled it into submission, and dragged it gasping and snarling into the light of the living world. When Cerberus was shown, the final labor was complete. Heracles had done what no man had done before. And still, peace did not come. He fought more wars, loved again, lost again. Hera's hatred never really cooled. In the end, it wasn't a monster that killed him. It was something far quieter, a tunic soaked in the poisoned blood of the centaur Nessus. His wife Deianira believed it to be a charm to secure his love. She didn't know it would burn him from the inside out. As the venom spread, Heracles felt his body turning against him. He climbed Mount Oda, built his own funeral pyre, and lay upon it. No one dared light the fire until Philoctetes, a simple man with a steady hand, stepped forward. In return, he received Heracles' great bow. Flames rose. The mortal part of Heracles burned away. What remained, his godhood rose. Zeus drew his son up to Olympus. There, Heracles was made immortal and married to Hebe, goddess of youth. The man who had been torn apart by guilt and suffering became a god people prayed to for strength. His labors turned into the measuring stick of heroism itself. If Heracles was the greatest of Greek heroes, Theseus was the most human. He was as comfortable in a council hall as he was in a battlefield. He could break monsters and build cities. He belonged not only to myth, but to politics, to law, to the slow shaping of a civilization. Athens would one day call him its founder in spirit. Theseus's life carried both muscle and mind, the twin traits of a people who worshipped Athena with spear in one hand and olive branch in the other. He was born of two fathers. His mother, Aethra, lay with Aegeus, king of Athens, and with Poseidon, god of the sea, on the same night. From mortal and divine seed, Theseus was conceived, a boy meant to bridge worlds. He grew up in Trojan, far from Athens, never told the full truth of his blood. Before leaving, Aegeus had hidden a sword and sandals beneath a heavy stone, telling Aethra that when the boy was strong enough to lift it, he would be ready to come to him. Years passed. At 16, with both effort and a hint of joy, Theseus lifted the stone, claimed the sword and sandals, and understood that his life was no longer small. Most would have taken the safe route to Athens by sea. Theseus chose the long land road instead, the one haunted by killers and monsters. A king, he believed, should clean the path to his own throne. On that road he fought 6 evils. He killed Periphetes, the club-bearer, and kept his weapon as a symbol. He defeated Sinis, who tore travelers apart with bent pine trees, and paid him back in the same way. He faced Sciron, who made strangers wash his feet only to kick them into the sea and cast him over the same cliff. He wrestled Circean, beating brute force with skill. He found Procrustes, who made travelers fit his bed by stretching or cutting them, and laid him out on his own device, letting his cruelty return to him. By the time Theseus finished the journey, the road itself was safer. His path to Athens was cleared not just for himself, but for everyone who would walk it after. In Athens, King Aegeus did not recognize him. At his side stood Medea, a sorceress with a long memory and little patience for rivals. She knew exactly who Theseus was, and she knew what he would mean for her. She convinced Aegeus to invite the newcomer to a feast and poisoned his cup. But as Theseus raised it, he also raised the sword Aegeus had left for him beneath the stone. Recognition struck like lightning. Aegeus knocked the cup from his hand and embraced his son before the whole court. Medea fled, but joy in these stories never stays long. Athens was under a shadow. Years earlier, the city had lost a war to Crete. As punishment, King Minos demanded a cruel tribute. Every 9 years, 7 young men and 7 young women would be sent to Crete to be fed to the Minotaur. The Minotaur was no ordinary beast. He was a half-man, half-bull born from divine anger and human arrogance, a living symbol of Minos's sin. Poseidon had once sent a magnificent bull from the sea, expecting Minos to sacrifice it. Minos kept it instead. For this, the gods cursed his wife, Pasiphae, with a desire that broke the natural order. From her union with the bull came the Minotaur Asterion, a creature too terrible to live among men. Minos hid him in a labyrinth built by Daedalus, a maze so twisted that even memory unraveled inside it. When Theseus heard of the tribute, he did not hesitate. He volunteered to go with the doomed youths, not as a victim, but as a hunter stepping into the monster's den. Before he left, he made Aegeus a promise. If I return alive, the sails of my ship will be white. If I die, they will remain black. The ship departed with dark sails. In Crete, fate shifted again. Ariadne, daughter of Minos and half-sister to the Minotaur, saw Theseus and felt something break loose inside her: pity, love, rebellion, maybe all three. She gave him a ball of thread and the secret of how to use it. "Tie one end at the entrance," she told him. "Unwind it as you walk, follow it back if you survive." That night, Theseus descended into the labyrinth. The air grew colder. The stone pressed closer. Passages twisted back on themselves, turning direction and distance into a blur. In the center, where the maze was darkest, he found the Minotaur. No speeches, no bargains. Just a prince and a monster meeting in the deep silence beneath a foreign palace. They fought, muscle against horn, blade against rage. Theseus, guided by training and by something sharper than fear, waited, watched, and then stepped in close and struck the creature. Deep under the Cretan palace, stone turned into more stone, and the air felt like it had never known the sun. There, in the heart of the maze, Theseus met the Minotaur and ended it with steel and will. When the creature fell, he stood in the dark, breathing hard, his hand still wrapped around the hilt, the other gripping the thread, the one thin lifeline leading him back. Step by slow step, he followed the string through the twisting corridors until a faint, distant light opened above him. As he emerged from the labyrinth carrying silence and blood in his memory, he did not leave alone. He freed the Athenian captives and fled with Ariadne, sailing out across the moonlit Aegean. For a brief moment, it looked like a happy ending. The ship cut across black water. The air was cool. Ariadne stood at the rail and watched the waves, believing she had traded a cursed palace for a life beside the man who killed her family's shame. But love in these stories is never simple. On the island of Naxos, Theseus left her behind. Some say Dionysus whispered into his dreams and claimed Ariadne for himself. Others say Theseus, thinking like a future king, feared what it would mean to bring a Cretan princess home to Athens. Whatever the reason, she woke to the sound of the sea and nothing else. No ship, no oars, only unfamiliar stars and sand beneath her feet. Theseus sailed on. Wrapped in grief, exhaustion, or simple distraction, he forgot to change the sails from black to white as he had promised his father. From the cliffs of Attica, King Aegeus watched the horizon. He saw the dark hull, the dark sails, and his heart answered before his mind could. He believed his son was dead. In despair, he threw himself from the rocks into the sea below. That water would carry his name forever, the Aegean. The ship returned to a city that had lost a king and gained a shaken heir. Once he took the throne, Theseus did not sit still. He gathered the scattered villages around Athens, pulling them into one body, Attica one city-state instead of many isolated little fears. He created festivals and games, honored the gods with temples, and gave the people common laws instead of private grudges. He was a hero not just of sword and story, but of structure, the kind of hero you feel in the way a city breathes. And still, he kept stepping into myth. He fought beside Heracles against the Amazons, went to the underworld with his reckless friend Perseus on a doomed plan to steal Persephone from Hades himself. That journey did not end in glory. Perseus was swallowed by the earth. Theseus found himself fixed to the chair of forgetfulness, his mind slowly fading in that air thick with death. Only Heracles, passing through on his own path, had the strength to tear him free. But time, like fate, keeps walking. Athens, the city he had helped shape, changed around him. New thinkers, new powers, new problems, and a people growing tired of kings altogether. In the end, Theseus was pushed out of the city he had built. He fled to the island of Skyros, where a jealous king pretended to welcome him and then had him thrown from a cliff. There were no crowds below, no songs, no armor. As only rocks, wind, and a long fall. Years later, his bones would be brought back to Athens with honor, but at the moment of his death he was alone, and yet his shadow stayed. Heracles became the symbol of pure strength, but Theseus came to stand for something quieter, the strength of the city itself. Law, cooperation, the idea that people could be more than scattered villages. As Athens would rise with Athena on its coins and temples, but beneath its streets it still whispered his name. Long before Troy went up in flames, while the memory of Titans was already fading into legend, another story unfurled over the sea. It was not just a story of one man, but of 50. A ship full of heroes, a dragon-guarded prize, and the slow way ambition eats itself from the inside. At the center of it all was Jason. He was not raised in a palace. He was not crowned by favor. He was shaped by loss and the quiet promise of revenge. His story began in Iolcus, a coastal city in Thessaly. His father, Aeson, had once worn the crown there. But Aeson's own brother, Peleus, took the throne for himself, one more king who loved power more than blood. A child like Jason is dangerous to men like that. Forewarned that his nephew might one day be his undoing, Peleus moved to have him killed. But Aeson had friends and warnings and a father's desperation. The baby was smuggled away, carried from the palace and given to Chiron, the wise centaur who raised heroes in the whispering wild. In Chiron's cave, Jason grew up with the sound of wind in the trees, the weight of spears in his hands, and old songs in his ears. Songs of kings who lost everything and sometimes won it back. When he was grown, Jason walked back into Iolcus. On his way, he came to the river Anoros, swollen and rough. An old woman waited at the bank, asking to be carried across. He lifted her onto his shoulders without thinking and stepped into the current. The river tore off one of his sandals and carried it away. The old woman, of course, was Hera in disguise. She took note. Jason kept walking, one sandal on, one foot bare, straight into the city his uncle had stolen. Peleus saw him and blanched. An oracle had whispered a warning long ago. Beware the man who comes with one shoe. Jason didn't roar or threaten. He simply told the truth, who he was, whose son he was, what should have been his. Peleus, too cautious to kill him outright, wrapped his fear in a challenge. If Jason wanted the throne, he would first have to do the impossible, sail to distant Colchis and bring back the golden fleece. The fleece had its own story. Once, a golden ram had carried a boy named Phrixus to safety, flying over the sea. When Phrixus reached Colchis, he sacrificed the ram in gratitude. Its fleece, shining like woven fire, was hung upon an oak in a sacred grove. A great serpent guarded it, and over all watched King Aeates, son of the sun god Helios. No Greek had gone there and returned. Jason said yes. He called for allies and they came. They weren't an army. They were names that would echo forever: Heracles, Orpheus with his lyre, Atalanta, swift with bow in hand, Castor and Polydeuces, the twin riders, Meleager, Theseus, Zeus and Calais, winged sons of the north wind. 50 heroes all told, each with their own stories, their own gods watching from above. They gathered at a ship called Argo, built by Argus with Athena's help. In its prow, Athena placed a plank of sacred oak from Dodona wood that could whisper prophecy. The ship itself became a presence, creaking, warning, guiding. Together, they pushed off from shore and sailed east toward the unknown. Their first troubles wore human faces. On Lemnos, they found a land ruled only by women, the men all dead by their wives' hands. Jason lay with Hypsipyle, their queen, and left behind sons who would grow up without his shadow. In Thrace, they met Phineus, a blind prophet tormented by harpies that swooped from the sky to foul any food set before him. The winged brothers, Zeus and Calais, chased the harpies away, and in gratitude Phineus gave Jason something more valuable than gold directions. He told them how to face the clashing rocks, two living cliffs that smashed together like jaws on any ship foolish enough to pass. At his advice, they sent a dove through first. It lost a single tail feather. Then Argo rowed forward as fast as oars could move. The rocks slammed behind them, scraping the stern but letting them through. From that day on, the rocks stayed still. The sea, it seemed, granted passage once someone proved they were brave enough to demand it. Finally, they reached Colchis. The air there felt heavier, thicker with smoke, iron, and old magic. King Aeetes did not kill them at once. Strangers in those days were sacred, but hospitality did not mean mercy. He agreed to give Jason the fleece if he could complete 3 tasks: yoke fire-breathing bulls, plow a field with them, sow it with dragons' teeth, then defeat the warriors that clawed their way up from the earth. It was a polite way of saying die far from home. The gods, however, had their own plans. At Hera's urging, Eros drew his bow and struck Medea, Aeetes' daughter. Medea was no ordinary princess. She was a priestess of Hecate, skilled in herbs, curses, and moonlit rites, cold and distant as frost. Then she saw Jason, and something inside her cracked open. She gave him a potion that would shield his skin from fire. She told him how to sow the dragon's teeth and then throw a single stone among the risen warriors so they would turn their swords on each other. Finally, under cover of night, she led him to the sacred grove where the fleece hung, the serpent coiled beneath it, always awake. Medea sang to it, old, dark words. The coils loosened, the great head lowered, and the serpent slipped into sleep. Jason took the fleece, warm, heavy, glowing, and fled into the dark with Medea at his side. Aeetes followed with ships and fury. The lovers bought time in the ugliest way. Medea took her young brother Odysseus, killed him, and scattered his body into the waves. Her father had to stop and gather the pieces for burial. The Argo sailed on, carrying men, magic, and a stain that never washed out. Their journey home was a long spiral of delays and dangers, past Scylla and Charybdis, past strange shores and shifting winds. But in time, they made it back to Iolcus. Jason held the fleece. He had done the impossible. Peleus still refused him, so Medea did what she did best. She twisted fear into action. She convinced Peleus's daughters that they could make their old father young again by cutting him into pieces and boiling him with her spells. They did as she said. He did not live again. The people turned on them. Jason and Medea were driven out. They settled in Corinth for a while, but heroes in these tales rarely stay satisfied. Jason wanted more security, more status, more legitimacy. He decided to marry a Corinthian princess and cast Medea aside like a chapter he wished he hadn't written. Medea responded the only way a woman with god blood and broken trust knows how, with total destruction. She sent the princess a poisoned gown that burned her alive when she put it on. Then Medea, in an act that horrified even the gods, killed her own sons by Jason so he would lose everything: future, name, and legacy. Then she left, carried away in a chariot drawn by dragons, a gift from her grandfather Helios. Jason lived on, but something in him never stood back up. He eventually returned to Iolcus, an old man moving through places that no longer remembered him. One day he sat beneath the beached, rotting hull of the Argo, the proud ship of his youth. A beam cracked and fell. It struck him on the head and killed him where he sat. No battlefield, no crowds. Just a man and the bones of the ship that once carried his glory. Still, his story did not vanish. People kept telling it, the gathering of heroes, the shining prize, the love turned monstrous, the ambition that devoured itself. In Jason, Greece saw something painfully familiar. How far someone will go for a throne and what it costs to reach for more than the world is ready to give. And then there was Thebes. Some cities in these stories are crowned in clean victories. Thebes is not one of them. Where other heroes fought monsters or foreign kings, Theban rulers often fought their own blood, their own gods, their own past. The city's history felt like a knot of curses. It started with a search. Cadmus, a Phoenician prince, went out to find his sister Europa, whom Zeus had stolen away in the shape of a white bull. He never found her. Instead, he went to Delphi to ask what to do next. The oracle told him to stop searching, follow a cow, and build a city wherever it finally lay down. So he did. When the animal at last folded its legs beneath it, Cadmus took it as a sign. He sent men to fetch water for a sacrifice. They didn't come back. A serpent sacred to Ares guarded the spring there. It killed them all. Cadmus took up a spear, hunted the serpent, and killed it himself. Athena appeared and told him what to do next: plant the serpent's teeth in the earth. From that black soil, armed warriors clawed their way out the Sparta, the sown men. They turned on each other until only 5 still stood. Those 5 became the founding families of Thebes. Cadmus became their king, but killing Ares's sacred beast had a price. Cadmus had to serve the war god for 8 years. After that penance, he married Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. The gods themselves came to the wedding. They brought gifts. Among them was a necklace forged by Hephaestus, a shimmering thing of beauty that carried a curse in every link. As everyone who owned it would eventually drown in misfortune. So Thebes began in a moment of joy already wired for disaster. Time passed. Children and grandchildren grew. Cadmus's daughters found only tragedy. Ino went mad and hurled herself and her child into the sea. Autono's son, Actaeon, stumbled upon Artemis bathing and was torn apart by his own hunting dogs. Semele, who loved Zeus and was loved by him in turn, was tricked by Hera into asking to see him in his full divine form, and was burned to ash when he appeared as lightning. Agave, caught in Dionysus's wild madness, ripped her own son Pentheus to pieces with her bare hands, believing he was a lion. Thebes was a city that never seemed to wake from a nightmare. But the deepest cut came with Laius. Laius, a descendant of Cadmus, became king of Thebes and married Jocasta. The gods sent him a message: if he ever had a son, that son would kill his father and marry his mother. He heard the warning. He ignored the lesson. He lay with Jocasta, and a baby boy was born. Fearful and stubborn, Laius had the newborn's ankles pierced and bound, and ordered a servant to leave him on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron to die. But pity sometimes sneaks past destiny's guards. The servant couldn't do it. He handed the child to a shepherd instead. The shepherd took the baby to Corinth, where a childless king and queen, Polybus and Merope, took him in and raised him as their own. They named him Oedipus, swollen foot, after the wounds on his ankles, and never told him whose blood moved inside him. Oedipus grew up believing he knew who he was. The people of Corinth called him prince. Polybus and Merope called him son. He had a place, a name, a future laid out like a road. But rumors travel quicker than comfort. Whispers reached him, questions about his birth, about why he looked like no one, about why the king and queen had never spoken of the day he entered their lives. Those whispers dug into him like splinters. So he went where Greeks went when the world stopped making sense, to Delphi. He stood before the oracle hoping to ask, "Who am I? Where do I come from?" The answer he got was something else entirely. He was told that he would kill his father and marry his mother. No names, no context, just that. Horrified, Oedipus decided to run from the only parents he knew. If Polybus and Merope were his father and mother, then he would save them by leaving. So he fled Corinth, trying to outrun a prophecy he only half understood and walking straight toward the truth he feared most. On a lonely road at a dusty crossroads not far from Delphi, he met a chariot. The man inside was older, wrapped in authority and impatience. Servants flanked him. The path was narrow. Words were exchanged about who should move, who had the right of way, who mattered more in this small, hard moment. Anger flared. Pride answered pride. In the heat of rage, Oedipus killed the stranger and his retinue, leaving their bodies in the road. He walked away thinking he had defended his honor. He had no idea he had just murdered his real father, King Laius of Thebes. He went on to Thebes, a city wrapped in a different kind of suffering. It wasn't an army choking its gates. It was a monster. The Sphinx sat on the road, a creature with a lion's body, a woman's face, and great wings that cast long shadows. She devoured anyone who failed her riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? The bones of the dead were her punctuation. Oedipus listened, thought, answered, "Man, we crawl as infants, stand tall as adults, laying on a staff in old age." Well, the answer shattered the curse. The Sphinx threw herself from a cliff. The road cleared. Thebes could breathe again. They pulled Oedipus in as a savior, a stranger who had freed them from terror. In gratitude, they gave him the empty throne and the widowed queen as a bride. Her name was Jocasta. Neither of them knew. He had killed his father, he had married his mother, and for a while life looked good. Years passed. Oedipus ruled well. He and Jocasta had 4 children, Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene. The city prospered. Then the sickness came. Plague swept through Thebes, a heavy, invisible hand pressing down on fields and cribs and lungs. Animals died. Babies died, the streets filled with mourning. The oracle's answer returned. The land was polluted by unpunished blood. Some crime, some old, buried sin had to be dragged into the light. Oedipus, who had built his identity on solving riddles, decided to solve this one too. Piece by piece, truth began to surface. Mention of an old man killed at a crossroads, a servant who survived an attack long ago. The scars on his own ankles. The way Jocasta went pale at certain names. The blind prophet Tiresias resisted speaking, but when pushed, he named Oedipus himself as the source of the rot, father and brother to his children, husband and son to his queen. The realization landed like a blow. Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus took the pins from her dress and drove them into his own eyes. He chose not to see what he had already seen too late. The king who had once answered the Sphinx's riddle could not solve this one without breaking. He begged to be cast out. He left Thebes as a broken figure on the road, led not by guards or servants, but by his daughter Antigone, who walked beside him as his guide and courage. Near Colonus, in a quiet grove, he finally found a kind of peace. The earth opened metaphorically, or literally some say, and he vanished into it. The gods kept the place of his grave secret, but curses moved through bloodlines. Eteocles and Polynices, his sons, turned on each other for the throne. Eteocles held power. Polynices was driven into exile. From exile, Polynices gathered allies in Argos and returned with an army, the Seven, against Thebes. The brothers met at the city gates, armor on, each determined not to yield. They killed each other in single combat. Thebes stayed standing, but something inside it cracked for good. Antigone tried to hold onto the old ways. She believed that even an enemy brother deserved burial. Creon, their uncle and new king, forbade it. He wanted Polynices' body left unburied, a warning, a humiliation. Antigone went anyway. She covered her brother with earth in secret. When she was caught, she refused to apologize. For that, Creon sentenced her to be buried alive. The gods answered with madness and death in his house, a wife, a son, a future, all lost. Thebes endured, but its kingship spun like a wheel of misfortune. Oedipus' story was never about slaying beasts or founding empires. It was about something colder, how a man can do everything he can to avoid a prophecy and still walk straight into it. He wanted the truth. He demanded it. And when he finally got it, it destroyed him. Thebes was built on serpent bones and riddles. And in the end, no clever answer could outargue the gods. Years later, far from Thebes' walls, another story began to coil itself around the world, this time not around a single man, but around a woman's face, a marriage vow, and a promise all of Greece had made without truly thinking it through. Of all the wars ever fought on mortal ground, none would echo louder than the one at Troy. It didn't start with a siege. It started with a celebration. At the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, all the gods were invited except Eris, goddess of discord. They thought leaving her out would keep the peace. Instead, she walked into the feast anyway and rolled a golden apple across the floor. On it were 3 words, "To the fairest." 3 goddesses reached for it: Hera, queen of the heavens; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire. None of them were used to hearing no. To settle it, they chose a mortal judge, Paris, a prince of Troy living as a shepherd in the hills because of an old omen that said he would someday bring fire to his city. So on Mount Ida, the goddesses stood before him one by one and offered bribes. Hera promised him power, kingship over all men. Athena promised victory and wisdom, unbeaten in war, unmatched in thought. Aphrodite smiled and offered something simpler and more dangerous, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose her. He handed Aphrodite the apple, and with that single choice, the threads of many lives twisted tighter. The woman Aphrodite had promised was Helen. Helen of Sparta was the daughter of Zeus and the mortal queen Leda. As she grew, princes from all over Achaea came seeking her hand, drawn not just by her beauty, but by the power her children would carry. Her mortal father, Tyndareus, feared what would happen if one man won her and all the others walked away angry. On the advice of Odysseus, he made the suitors swear a binding oath. Whoever won Helen, the rest would swear to protect that marriage and punish anyone who violated it. They laughed and agreed. It was easier than fighting then and there. But oaths, once made, have a way of being remembered by powers older than laughter. Helen eventually married Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon and queen of Sparta. Their rule was strong. Their halls were filled with wealth and guests. Then Paris arrived not as a thief but as a guest, under the sacred protection of hospitality. He saw Helen, and whether it was her will or Aphrodite's or both, she went with him. They sailed back across the Aegean, leaving behind a husband whose name meant strength of the people. The war began the moment the ship left shore. It just didn't have spears in it yet. Menelaus called on the oath. Those who had once courted Helen now gathered to avenge her. Odysseus of Ithaca, clever and reluctant. Nestor of Pylos, old and full of stories. Ajax the greater, huge and grim. Ajax the lesser, swift and lethal. Diomes of Argos, Idomeneus of Crete, dozens of others. Only two tried to slip away from destiny. Odysseus pretended to be mad, plowing his fields with salt. A clever messenger put his baby son in front of the plow. When Odysseus swerved to avoid the child, his act was exposed. Achilles, whose mother Thetis knew he was destined to die at Troy, was hidden among the daughters of Lycomedes, dressed in women's clothes. Odysseus again used a trick, laying weapons among jewelry and watching which gifts drew the boy's eye. Achilles reached for spear and shield. His war had begun. The Greek fleet gathered at Aulis, 1,000 ships creaking in the harbor. Bronze armor gleamed, sails billowed or should have. The wind didn't come. The army sat on the shore, waiting, angry, superstitious. The seer Calchas said Artemis was angry, offended by something Agamemnon had done or said, and only a terrible sacrifice would calm her. The name he spoke was Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter. Some say she was lured to Aulis with the promise of marriage to Achilles. Some say Artemis saved her at the last second and replaced her with a deer. Most say the blade fell and a girl died so ships could move. Either way, the wind rose, the fleet sailed, and nothing in the world would ever be quite the same. They landed on Trojan shores not as raiders but as a storm given human shape. Priam's city Troy, or Ilion, stood behind high walls said to have once known the labor of gods. His sons defended it, Paris, beautiful and hollow, Deiphobus, eager for glory, and Hector, who didn't ask for this war but carried it anyway because someone had to. The gods, watching from their high places, took sides like gamblers. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon favored the Greeks. Aphrodite, Ares, Apollo, and Artemis stood with Troy. Zeus tried to stay neutral, but even he waned, pulled by fate and by the threads of his children's lives. By the time Homer starts singing the Iliad, 9 years have passed. The war is no longer a fresh wound. It's a scar that keeps splitting open. The Greeks have built a long camp along the beach, their ships drawn up on the sand like black teeth. They raid the countryside, burn towns, take supplies and captives, then return to their tents to argue about honor and spoils. The Trojans watch from their walls, bleeding slowly. As allies march in to stand beside them, men like Sarpedon from Lycia, Memnon from distant lands, each bringing fresh strength to a tired war. Nobody leaves, nobody wins. They just keep killing each other because to stop would mean admitting the war never should have started. But wars don't really live in walls and armies. They live inside individual hearts. And on the Greek side, 2 hearts burned brighter and more dangerously than the rest. Agamemnon, who wore the title King of Kings and believed it gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. And Achilles, the best warrior on the field, the one man everyone knew was fated to die young, who had decided that if he must die, he would make sure the world remembered his name. Their clash almost doomed the entire Greek cause. In one raid, the Greeks took many captives. Among them were Chrysis, daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Briseis, a woman from Lionessus. Agamemnon kept Chrysis. Achilles took Briseis. Chrysis's father came to the camp bearing ransom and reverence, begging for his daughter's release. Agamemnon insulted him and sent him away. The priest prayed. Apollo listened. He came not with a thunderbolt, but with plague, fever sliding through animals and men, quiet as shadow, deadly as any spear. Calchas, the seer, eventually spoke the hard truth. To end the plague, Chrysis had to be sent back. Agamemnon obeyed, but he would not lose alone. He demanded Briseis from Achilles as compensation. In that moment, he didn't just take a woman, he took Achilles' honor in front of all the others. Achilles stood up in the assembly. He called Agamemnon greedy, unfit to lead, a coward who let others die for his pride. His hand went to his sword. Athena stopped him, whispering restraint into his anger, so he chose a different kind of weapon. He swore he would no longer fight. He returned to his tent and stayed there. His myrmidons stayed with him, silent and loyal, their absence like a missing limb from the Greek army. From that day, the war shifted. Without Achilles, the Greeks began to lose ground. From the Trojan side, Hector rode out more boldly, his spear steady, his heart torn between love of his family and duty to the city. He didn't start the war. He didn't want the war. But as long as Troy stood and his father ruled, he would stand between the Greeks and the gates. The Iliad is the story of what happens when Achilles' rage and Hector's duty finally collide, and how the gods, for all their thunder, watched two men decide the shape of an age. By the 9th year of the war, the Greeks were tired, the Trojans were desperate, and the ground between them was soaked with too many names. Day after day, the Trojans pushed the Greeks back toward the sea. Ships burned, armor cracked. The beach that had once felt like the start of a great adventure had become a graveyard. The first Greek to leap from his ship, Perseus, had died in the opening clash. Now another man stood at the edge of everything. Patroclus, the one person who could still reach Achilles through the wall of anger around him. Some called Patroclus his closest friend. Others whispered he was something more. What mattered was simple. Achilles listened to him when he listened to no one else. Patroclus watched the Trojans break the Greek defenses and surge toward the ships with fire in their hands. If the ships burned, there would be no going home for anyone. As he went to Achilles' tent, to the man who had chosen rage and withdrawal over battle. "Let me go in your place," Patroclus begged. "Let me wear your armor, let them think you've returned. Let me turn them back from the ships." Achilles, torn between pride and fear for his friend, gave in but with limits. "Drive them from the ships," he said, "then come back. Do not chase them to the walls of Troy." Patroclus put on Achilles' armor. He climbed into Achilles' chariot. He led Achilles' myrmidons into battle. For a while it worked. The Trojans saw the familiar armor, the familiar horses, and panic surged through their ranks. The Greeks rallied. The fire was pushed back from the hulls. But Patroclus was human, and battle has a way of making humans forget their limits. The taste of victory pulled him forward. He kept driving the Trojans back all the way to the gates of Troy. There, beneath those high walls, he met Hector. Their fight was short and brutal. Hector struck him down, and as Patroclus fell, something more than a single life ended. Whatever softness Achilles still had in his heart fell with him. When the news reached Achilles, his grief was not quiet. He didn't just cry. He screamed, he poured dust over his head. He tore at his own hair and clothing. The camp shook with the sound of it. He had refused to fight for honor. He had refused to fight for kings. But now the war had taken the one person he could not lose, while he sat in his tent, clutching his anger. Achilles stepped back onto the field for one reason only: vengeance. His mother Thetis went to Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, and asked for new armor for her son, a shield etched with the whole world and bronze that caught the light like a burning sun. When Achilles returned to battle, no one could stop him. He cut men down like wheat. Chariots splintered under his onslaught. The river ran red and swelled with bodies. The Trojans broke and ran for the safety of their walls, but Achilles locked onto one figure alone, Hector. The 3 times they ran around the city, Hector trying to find some opening, Achilles following like a storm that would not break. At last, Hector turned to face him. He fought bravely, but the outcome was already written in every god's eyes. Achilles struck him down. With the same fury that had once been love, he pierced Hector's body, tied him to his chariot, and dragged him in the dust around the walls of his own city. Day after day, he circled Troy with Hector's body trailing behind, denying him burial, denying Troy even the small mercy of mourning properly. It was only at night, when the camp was mostly still, that something changed. Old Priam, king of Troy, took his life in his hands. Guided by Hermes through the dark, he slipped into the Greek camp, past guards and sleeping men, and entered Achilles' tent. There, the old man knelt in front of the killer of his son. He kissed the hands that had taken Hector's life. He didn't speak as a king, he spoke as a father. He asked Achilles to remember his own father, far away, waiting to hear news of a son who might never return. Something inside Achilles finally cracked. The anger did not vanish, but grief came flooding through it. He wept with Priam. He agreed to return Hector's body. For a brief moment, there was a fragile thread of humanity in the middle of a monster of a war. Hector was buried. Priam went home under a truce of silence, and then the killing slowly resumed. Achilles would not live to see how it ended. A single arrow guided by Apollo, they said, fired by Paris of all people, found the one vulnerable spot on his body, his heel. The greatest warrior of his age died face down in the dust, young, unstoppable, and stopped. The Iliad closes not with the fall of Troy, but with funerals, with shared grief, with a sense that the story isn't over, just paused before the worst part. The horse had not yet been built, the gates had not yet opened, but the world was already leaning toward ruin. 10 years of war had hollowed men out. Troy, once glittering, now felt like an old lion ringed by hungry wolves. Priam's sons had fallen one by one, Hector, the shield of the city, Troilus, caught and killed while still just a boy, Polydorus, murdered in betrayal. The Trojans fought on not just for a city, but for memory, for a way of life that would vanish if the walls fell. The Greeks, on the other hand, sat in their smoky camp by the sea, tired of dying so far from home. Then one morning the lookout climbed the towers of Troy and saw something no one expected. The Greek camp was empty, no shouting. No fires, no soldiers, the ships were gone. In their place, out on the plain before the Scaean gate, stood a vast wooden horse. It towered above them, its sides made of smooth planks, its shape echoing the sacred animals of Poseidon. No answers, no explanation, just silence and that enormous thing staring at the city. Troy's joy came slowly, some urged caution. Priam, worn and wise, suspected some trick. Then a single man appeared, a Greek named Sinon, left behind, tied up, bloodied, begging for asylum. He told a story so careful it could have come from Odysseus' own mind. The horse, he said, was an offering to Athena. The Greeks, desperate after so many losses, had built it to win her favor and had finally sailed away. If the Trojans brought the horse inside their walls, they would gain Athena's protection and rule for generations. If they destroyed it, they would only bring more divine rage upon themselves. Not everyone believed him. Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, stepped forward and gave Troy the advice history would remember. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts. He hurled a spear into the side of the horse. The wood shuddered, something inside shifted. For a heartbeat, the truth almost burst out. Then the sea moved. The two huge serpents rose from the water, slithered over the sand, and wrapped themselves around Laocoon and his sons, crushing them to death while the city watched in horror. The people took it as a sign. They had refused a god once before. They would not do it again. With ropes and wheels, with singing and celebration, they dragged the horse inside the walls of Troy. The gates shut behind it. That night the fires burned low, the wine flowed, and the city slept in the false safety of stone. In the dark belly of the horse a trapdoor creaked open. Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, Diomedes. Others chosen for their cruelty as much as their courage climbed down into the sleeping city. Out at sea on the hidden isle of Tenedos, the Greek fleet slipped back over the waves, oars muffled, sails catching just enough wind. They reached the shore, they lit their torches. The signal had been given. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Neoptolemus cut through the palace like a storm, killing Priam at the very altar of Zeus. The king died clinging to a god statue in a hall that could no longer protect him. Cassandra, cursed to see the future and never be believed, was dragged from Athena's temple, her final warnings lost in the fire and screams. Hecuba watched the end of everything she had ever loved. Hector's baby son, Astyanax, was thrown from the walls so that no heir of Troy might one day rise again. Temples were looted, statues toppled, and the city that had defied 10 years of war burned in a single night. Helen stood amid the ruin. Some stories say she cried and begged Menelaus for mercy. Others say she stood straight, beautiful, and distant, as if the flames had nothing to do with her. Menelaus lifted his sword to kill her, looked into her face, and let it fall. He took her back to Sparta. Victory, if that's what it was, tasted like ash. At dawn, smoke climbed where towers used to stand. The walls were broken. As the gods looked away, the war was over, but the curse it had created was just getting started. The Greeks sailed home with their arms full of gold and their lives full of doom. Ajax the Lesser, who had violated Cassandra in Athena's temple, drowned in a storm, the sea swallowing his arrogance. Agamemnon reached Mycenae, but he had not truly come home. Clytemnestra, who had watched her daughter Iphigenia die for his war, had been waiting with Aegisthus and a sharpened blade. He walked into his own palace and never walked out again. In that house, revenge and murder had become a family tradition. Their son Orestes would one day return, kill his own mother and her lover, and be hunted by the Furies until even the gods had to decide what justice meant. Menelaus and Helen drifted long on strange seas before Sparta rose on the horizon again. They ruled together, but her name would never be clean. Every time someone said Helen, they heard the crackle of Troy's burning walls. And then there was Odysseus. He had thought up the horse. He had led men through the cities last night. He had taken part in the desecration of temples, and the gods, especially Poseidon, had noticed. For him, the war was only half of his story. The other half would be 10 years of storms and islands, monsters and enchantresses, choices and losses. Troy was gone, but its shadow followed every ship as it turned toward home. When Troy finally fell and the flames died down, the stories did not end. They simply turned their faces toward the sea. Among the ships pushed out into the dark water was one that would wander farther than all the rest. On it was Odysseus. The waves did not carry him home, they flung him. Island to island, storm to strange calm, his ship stumbled across a world that felt half dream, half punishment. On one jagged shore, he and his men were trapped in the cave of Polyphemus, a cyclops with a single glaring eye and a hunger for human flesh. Odysseus gave him wine, waited until the giant's eyelids sagged with sleep, then drove a sharpened stake into that one bright eye. "Who did this to you?" the other Cyclopes called as Polyphemus screamed and clawed at the air. "Nobody," he roared in agony, and they turned away confused. It was clever, it was necessary, it was also a mistake. As Odysseus' ship pulled away, he couldn't resist shouting his real name back to shore, a brief flicker of pride. Polyphemus called upon his father, Poseidon. The sea god listened. From that moment on, the ocean itself became Odysseus' enemy. He reached the island of Circe, a sorceress with calm eyes and dangerous hands who turned his men into pigs with a cup of wine and a whispered spell. With the help of a god-given herb, Odysseus resisted her magic. They struck a bargain. The spell was reversed. The pigs became men again, shaking and ashamed. He stayed with her for a year too long but warm. Her beds, her feasts, her songs softened the sharp edges of his mission. Then he left her island and sailed to the edge of the world, where the air grew thin and the water turned heavy and black. There he descended into night. At the border of the underworld he spoke with the dead. Old comrades, worn kings, shades who flinched at the memory of sunlight. He met his mother who told him of Ithaca, of the life that kept moving without him. He asked the blind prophet Tiresias how to appease the gods and find his way home. The answers were never simple. They never are in Greek stories. He walked back to his ship with the voices of the dead clinging to him like mist. On another stretch of sea, he faced the sirens, creatures whose song promised understanding. Promised that if you just listened a little longer, everything would finally make sense. Knowing their power, Odysseus had his men plug their ears with wax and lash him to the mast. He screamed for them to untie him as the song curled through his mind, promising secrets and peace and the end of struggle. His men rode on, deaf to his pleas. They did not unbind him until the Sirens' island was a shadow behind them. He survived knowledge, but it left claw marks. Then came Scylla and Charybdis, a monster with many snapping mouths on one side, a swirling, ship-devouring whirlpool on the other. Some choices are not between good and bad, but between two different kinds of loss. Odysseus steered closer to Scylla, knowing he would lose some men instead of all. Their screams rose and faded quickly as she plucked them from the deck. He kept his hands on the wheel and did not look back. Storm by storm, mistake by mistake, the crew thinned. At last, all his men were gone. Odysseus alone drifted to the shore of the Phaeacians, a people who listened to his story in firelight and did not laugh, did not turn away. Moved by his suffering, they placed him on a final ship and sent him home. He reached Ithaca not as a shining hero, but as a ragged stranger. His beard was long, his clothes were torn, and his eyes carried the distance of 10 haunted years. In his house, time had also not stood still. Suitors filled his hall, drinking his wine, butchering his livestock, trying to win the hand of Penelope, who had waited for him through rumor and silence. By day she wove a burial shroud, and by night she quietly unwove it, stretching out time, keeping her promise alive for as long as she could. Odysseus did not storm in and shout his name. He moved in shadows first. He tested loyalties. His son Telemachus stood with him, grown from child to man in his absence. His old swineherd still remembered the bond of guest and master. At last, the time for disguise ended. In his own hall, Odysseus took up the great bow that no other man had been able to string. He bent it as easily as if he'd never left, and the sound of the string snapping into place was the first crack of thunder in a coming storm. Arrows flew, suitors fell. The laughter that had filled his stolen home turned to screams and pleas and then to silence. When it was done, the floor was slick with blood. Odysseus stood in the center of it, not young, not clean, but home. The peace returned, but not the golden peace of stories. Only the thin, fragile peace that comes after violence when everyone in the room remembers what human beings are capable of. The cycle of war and vengeance never really stopped. It just spun a little slower for a while. Many other heroes of Troy met darker ends. Ajax the Lesser, who had violated Cassandra in Athena's temple, was struck down at sea, the goddess' anger following him in the shape of a storm. Diomedes, fierce and favored in battle, returned to his own city to find his wife unfaithful, and his people turned against him. He wandered west, founding cities that later ages would half remember, half invent. The Philoctetes, who had carried Heracles' bow and killed Paris with an arrow dipped in old poison, found no soft welcome waiting for him. He drifted too, a hero without a home. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, who had stained the palace of Troy with Priam's blood, was cut down at Apollo's altar in Delphi, perhaps a sacrifice to even a very old score. The Trojan War had promised glory, songs, eternal fame. What it delivered was broken households, marriages that would never heal, and men who had seen too much to sleep easily again. Those who stood together beneath the walls of Troy returned, if they returned at all, to bitter wives, angry gods, and stories that didn't sound like their memories. In the end, there were no true winners, only people who lived long enough to remember. And behind all of this, before the first ship ever touched the water, before the first spear ever found its mark, there was a different level of story. The level where God sat watching. Long before the smoke of Troy drifted over the sea, there was chaos. Out of that emptiness came Gaia, the earth, Uranus, the sky, Cronus, Rhea, and the Titans who ruled in a raw, heavy world with no temples, no hymns, only force. Cronus swallowed his children to keep his throne. Zeus escaped, grew up in secret, and rose against him, freeing his siblings, shattering his father's rule and casting the Titans into deep, iron-bound darkness. In their place, a new generation of gods took power, the Olympians. Their names would be carved into stone for centuries. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes. They built their court on Mount Olympus, high above the clouds, but their power reached down to every field and shoreline. Zeus ruled with a thunderbolt in his fist and a talent for politics in his mind. He wasn't just strong. He understood bargains. He rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, and divided the world between his brothers, the sky for himself, the sea for Poseidon, the underworld for Hades. The earth was shared ground, neutral only on the surface. Beside him, Hera reigned as queen, goddess of marriage and birth, and the long, slow anger of a woman repeatedly betrayed. Zeus' affairs were endless with goddesses, with nymphs, with mortal women. Each union produced children who reshaped the stories of the world: Perseus, Heracles, Helen, Minos, and many others. Hera could not strike Zeus directly, so she struck those he loved instead. Her vengeance burned slowly, but it almost never burned out. Athena stood for something different. She stepped out of Zeus' skull fully armed, the pain of her birth splitting his head open like an axe splits wood. She was reason made sharp, wisdom with a spear in its hand. She favored those who thought before they moved, builders, lawmakers, strategists, and one clever man named Odysseus. She preferred clean plans over chaos, strategy over slaughter. Where Ares enjoyed blood for its own sake, Athena valued wars that were won quickly and ended with something worth the cost. As Apollo and Artemis, twins born to Leto, carried light and shadow between them. Apollo shone in prophecy, music, and healing. He claimed Delphi as his own. Through the Pythia's cryptic words, he nudged kings and cities in directions they would only understand much later. But the same god who granted healing could also send plague, as the Greeks at Troy discovered when they insulted his priest. Artemis walked a wilder path. She hunted under the moon, guarded animals and young girls, and punished those who disturbed her sacred places with a swiftness that left no room for apology. Demeter, the grain mother, kept the world alive. But when her daughter Persephone was taken to the underworld, Demeter let the fields die, the earth browned, hunger spread, summer withdrew. Only when Persephone was allowed to return part of each year did the world green again. From this grief and compromise, the Greeks explained the seasons, winter as a mother mourning, spring as her brief joy. Aphrodite moved through all of this like a quiet storm. Born, some said, from sea foam where the severed pieces of Uranus struck the water, she carried love and desire in every step. She ruined men and gods with the same soft power. Married to Hephaestus, the limping blacksmith of Olympus, she gave her passion instead to Ares, binding love and war together in a knot nobody could untangle. Hermes slipped between all these stories, a messenger with winged sandals and a talent for mischief. He guarded boundaries and crossed them constantly, from the world of the living to the halls of Hades, from the court of Zeus to the tent of an exhausted soldier. Where Hermes walked, things moved, deals were made, paths opened or closed. And compared to the Titans, who were like the forces of nature given shape, the Olympians were something else. They looked like us, wanted like us, fought like us, just on a scale that shook mountains. Their jealousies, affairs, rivalries, and grudges were mirrors of human flaws, scaled up and lit in divine fire. People built temples to them, burned sacrifices, went to oracles to ask what they should do. Every house kept a small flame for Hestia, goddess of the hearth, quiet and constant. The gods were powerful but not untouchable. They were bound by oaths, tricked by mortals, and haunted, even Zeus, by the fear of being overthrown, just as they had overthrown the Titans. Zeus refused to father a child with Thetis because of a prophecy that her son would surpass his father. She married the mortal Peleus instead. Their son was Achilles, brilliant, doomed, and very much mortal. Even on Olympus, fear of the future never really went away. And then there were the gods who didn't sit comfortably on thrones at all. The ones who walked in shadows, in wild hills, in secret caverns filled with torchlight and drums. And chief among them was Dionysus. Dionysus' birth broke the rules. His mother, Semele of Thebes, was a mortal woman loved by Zeus. Hera, jealous and patient, whispered poison in Semele's ear until the girl demanded to see Zeus as he truly was. No mortal can look at full divinity and survive. Lightning took her, but Zeus wasn't ready to lose the child. He lifted the unborn infant from her body and stitched him into his own thigh. When the time was right, Dionysus was born again, twice born, carrying death and survival in his first breath. He didn't grow up on Olympus, learning how to sit on a throne. He wandered. Nymphs nursed him in hidden valleys. The satyrs, half goat and half impulse, danced around him. Where he went, vines crawled up stone and human minds loosened. He was the god of wine, yes, but more than that, he ruled everything that changes the self. Intoxication, music that makes you forget time, crowds that move as one, frenzy, ecstasy, and the frightening freedom of letting go. With him walked the Maenads, women who left behind their houses, their weaving, their careful roles, and ran wild through the mountains, clothed in skins carrying Theacy, staffs wrapped in ivy. Not everyone welcomed him. Some kings saw his rights and feared what would happen to their carefully ordered cities if people started listening to drums instead of laws. In Thebes, King Pentheus tried to outlaw Dionysus worship, to yank his vines out by the root. He locked the god up, mocked the wild women on the hills, and put himself above fear. It didn't last. Dionysus lured him into the forest in disguise, made him dress like a woman to spy on the Maenads. Caught in a god-given madness, Pentheus' own mother, Agave, and the other women tore him apart with their bare hands, thinking he was a wild animal. She carried his head back on a staff, smiling in triumph, until the trance faded and she saw what she'd done. The lesson settled over Thebes like evening. You can't ban what people feel forever. Dionysus was also the god of theater, of masks and makeup, of stepping into someone else's skin for a little while. At his festivals, tragedies and comedies were performed, stories about guilt and pride, about kings and killers, about gods and very ordinary people. Through those plays, the Greeks let their worst fears and secret hopes walk out into the open, wearing costumes so they could be looked at without flinching. With Dionysus came something new: mystery cults. These were not big public sacrifices in front of marble temples. They were secret rites held at night for the few who were willing to be initiated. In the Eleusinian mysteries, people walked in darkness and light to reenact Demeter's search for Persephone, her loss and her joy. They were promised not power, but comfort, a better fate after death. The Orphics, following the teachings of Orpheus, told of Dionysus as a god torn apart and reborn, and of souls trapped in cycles of life and death, seeking purification and release. These quiet, hidden practices didn't overthrow the Olympian gods, but they dug a deeper well under the old beliefs. They offered something the thunder and lightning of Zeus never really did. A personal hope, whispers that the soul might outlast the body, that suffering might mean something, that death itself might not be the end. And in those whispers, very slowly, the old, solid world of Greek religion began to shift. By the time the stories of Greece had stretched across centuries of telling, even the gods on Olympus no longer looked unshakable. The marble thrones were still there. The clouds still gathered at their feet. But hairline fractures had begun to creep through the old order. Ares and Athena wrestled, not with swords, but with influence, each trying to claim the hearts of warriors below. As Apollo kept falling in love with people who would not live long enough to grow old beside him. Hyacinthus, struck down by a flying discus. Daphne, turning into a laurel tree rather than be caught in his arms. Coronus, dying in childbirth and betrayal. Wherever Apollo's affections settled, someone ended up as a flower, a tree, a star in the sky, transformed instead of simply allowed to live. As Aphrodite watched mortals burn with desire and punished them for the very flames she stirred. Jealous wives, abandoned lovers, men driven to ruin by longing. Their suffering often began with a glance from her and ended with her turning away. The gods were supposed to be perfect. Instead, slowly, they began to look like magnified versions of the people who bowed to them, proud and petty, easily wounded, sometimes lost. In Dionysus, this whole system met its reflection and its first serious crack. He was a god, but he did not sit still. He walked the world barefoot, laughing, wine dripping from the rim of his cup. He could fill a village with joy in one night and leave it scattered and trembling in the morning. He broke kings who clung too tightly to control. He lifted up shepherds and servants, letting them feel, for a moment, what it was like to step outside themselves. And in his rites and mysteries, something new arrived. The idea that the divine was not only above you, but could move through you. In the flicker of torches, in the slow turning of a cup of wine, in dance that went on until dawn, ordinary people felt the edges of their identity blur. They weren't just praying to a god, they were letting that god live in them, if only for an evening. It was a dangerous kind of holiness, a beautiful one too. And as this spread, the image of the aloof, untouched Olympian began to feel a little older, a little less complete. Out beyond the wine-dark sea, marble temples stood clean and bright, but the world around them was shifting. Rome was rising. New ideas, new gods, new empires were waking up on the horizon. High on Olympus, with thunderbolts still flickering at his fingertips, Zeus could feel the wind changing. Even immortals can feel time move. The gods did not fade at once. They stayed, stepping down from the clouds again and again, walking in dreams, appearing in doorways, disguised as strangers on lonely roads. They took lovers, tested hearts, started wars, ended others. They left behind omens, statues, ruined cities, and children. These children of gods and mortals, the demigods, were born into a strange in-between, too human to live untouched, too divine to live quietly. Some became kings. Some became warnings. A few became stories so strong that even when their temples crumbled, their names remained. We've walked beside some of them already. Heracles, Perseus, Theseus, Atalanta, Bellerophon. They move through the myths like bright scars. Think of Heracles for a moment. His strength is the first thing everyone remembers: the lion's skin, the great club, the 12 impossible tasks. But his life did not begin as a celebration. It began as a trick. Zeus stretched one night into 3 to lie with Alcmene, a queen of Thebes, while her husband was away. From that long, stolen night, Heracles was born, and Hera's hatred followed his first breath. Snakes slid into his cradle. He strangled them without crying. People took that as a sign of greatness. Hera took it as a reason to try harder. As a grown man, Heracles married, had children, and for a little while lived the kind of quiet, ordinary life that never makes it into legend. Then madness came, a shadow sent by Hera. When his mind cleared, his family was dead by his own hand. From that moment on, his strength was no longer a gift. It was something he had to use to carry his guilt. The oracle at Delphi told him what he already sensed. If there was any way left to live with himself, it would be through labor and obedience. He served King Eurystheus, a smaller man in every way but rank, and took on 12 tasks that walked him to the edge of the world and back. The Nemean lion, the Hydra's snapping heads and burning blood, the vast, filthy stables of Augeas washed clean in a single day by the force of redirected rivers, birds with bronze feathers, a bull that shook Crete, horses that ate human flesh, a belt from the queen of the Amazons, the red cattle of Geryon at the edge of the western sea, golden apples from the garden of evening light. And finally, Cerberus, 3-headed guardian of the underworld, led for a brief moment into the sun. Each labor carved something out of him and added something else. He wasn't just proving he was strong. He was proving that human beings could walk into horror and keep walking. In the end, it wasn't a monster that ended him. It was a trick. A poisoned robe that burned his skin and would not stop. He built his own funeral pyre, climbed onto it, and let the flames rise. What was left of him, the part that had borne all that pain and kept moving, was lifted to Olympus. Even Hera, who had chased him from crib to grave, accepted him as a god. He became something unique, a mortal life turned into a deity through suffering and endurance. Long before Heracles, another child of Zeus had taken his first breath in fear. Perseus, born to Danae, a princess locked in a bronze chamber because her father was terrified of prophecy. The oracle had warned him, "Your grandson will kill you." He decided the best answer was to make sure his daughter never had a child at all. But bronze walls cannot keep out gods. Zeus came to her as a shower of golden light slipping through cracks in the metal. Perseus was conceived, born, and quickly judged too dangerous to live. Danae and her baby were placed in a wooden chest and thrown into the sea. They did not sink. They drifted to an island shore where a fisherman pulled them from the waves and brought them into his small, quiet life. For a time, Perseus grew up simple and safe. Then a king's desire for Danae turned his life sideways again. Apollodex, unable to remove Perseus openly, demanded a gift no one could survive fetching: the head of Medusa, the mortal Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone. Perseus went out into a world where nothing waited for him but death or miracle. The gods stepped in. Hermes lent him a sword. Athena gave him a shield polished bright as a second sky. He found the three gray sisters who shared one eye between them and snatched it from their hand until they told him what he needed to know. He found Medusa's lair at the edge of night. He walked backward, looking only at her reflection in the shield as she slept surrounded by silent statues. One clean stroke and it was done. From the bleeding neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a golden-bladed warrior. With their help and with hidden sandals and helm, Perseus escaped. On the way home, he saw a girl chained to a rock, Andromeda, left as sacrifice to a sea monster. He killed the beast, freed her, and brought her into his story. By the time he returned, Perseus had become exactly the kind of person prophecies are written about. He turned the cruel king to stone with a single, unveiled look from Medusa's head. He gave the kingdom to the good man who had once pulled him from the sea. And much later, at a set of funeral games, he threw a discus that struck an old man in the crowd, his grandfather, who had fled the prophecy long ago. It was an accident, it was also fate. The circle closed as it always does in these stories. From Perseus' line, Heracles would eventually be born. The blood of one demigod flowed forward into another, twisting myths together like threads on the same loom. There were more. Theseus, who walked the dangerous roads to Athens, fought bandits who preyed on travelers and descended into the labyrinth beneath the palace of Crete to face the Minotaur in the dark. Bellerophon, who rode Pegasus, killed the Chimera and then tried to fly higher than any man should toward Olympus itself, only to fall back to earth. Atalanta, swift as a deer, left as an unwanted infant and nursed by a bear. She hunted the great Caledonian boar. She raced men who wanted to marry her and beat them all until one used golden apples and distraction to win and ruin her freedom. These lives were never calm. To be half divine was to live pulled between worlds. The gods watched with fascination and fear. Mortals watched with awe and a strange comfort, because in these children they didn't just see power. They saw pain, choice, regret, all the messy things that made their own short lives feel meaningful. The gods might be immortal, but the demigods were the ones who felt human hearts beating inside their legends. Their bodies died. Their cities crumbled, but their stories did not. Underneath all of this, underneath the thunder, the jealousies, the quests and monsters, the Greeks believed there was something else at work. Something without a face or with three faces depending on how you told it. Fate. They called it Moira. Sometimes they imagined it as three sisters, the Moirai, the Fates, sitting at a loom older than the gods themselves. Clotho turning the spindle, spinning out the thread of each life. Lachesis measuring the length, deciding how long that life would run. Atropos, the one who cannot be turned aside, lifting the shears and cutting the thread when the time came. Even Zeus, with his lightning and his sky, could not snatch a thread back after it was cut. He might delay things, bend things, bargain and threaten and roar, but when Atropos' hand moved, even the king of the gods had to watch. So what could a human being do standing under that kind of sky? The answer was, not change fate but listen to it. That was the purpose of omens and oracles, of birds wheeling in the air and smoke twisting in strange shapes, of dreams that felt heavier than ordinary sleep. The Greeks built shrines in places where the world felt thin, where maybe the gods spoke a little more clearly. The greatest of these was the oracle at Delphi. There, in a stone temple on the slopes of a mountain, a woman called the Pythia sat on a tripod over a cleft in the rock. As she breathed in vapors from the earth, let her mind soften, and spoke in words that did not sound like everyday speech. Around her, priests listened, shaped her sounds into sentences, and handed them to kings like loaded weapons. Croesus, king of Lydia, once asked if he should wage war on Persia. The answer came, "If you cross this river, you will destroy a great empire." He marched forward, sure of victory. He crossed the river. The empire that fell was his own. The oracle had not lied. It had only been painfully precise. Oedipus' story also bent around a prophecy. Told he would kill his father and marry his mother, he fled from the people he thought were his parents, only to meet his real father on a crossroads he never recognized and kill him in a moment of anger. The more his family tried to outrun fate, the more tightly it caught them. The Greeks didn't pretend this was comforting, but they did think it was true. Delphi wasn't the only place where the future whispered. At Dodona, the wind in the leaves of sacred oaks was read as the voice of Zeus. On other islands and in other caves, gods spoke through dreams, through the flight of birds, through the way a sacrificed animal's liver looked in a priest's hands. Before battles, commanders watched the sky and the behavior of small things. A sneeze at the wrong moment, a flash of lightning, a bad pattern in the entrails, these were enough to delay an entire army. And to ignore a clear omen wasn't just seen as foolish, it was impious. It invited punishment. Seers like Calchas, who walked with the Greeks at Troy, and Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, held power not because they could change the future, but because they could see a little more of it than other people. Tiresias, who had lived as both man and woman, who had spoken unwanted truths to kings, carried the weight of 7 generations of memory. His visions did not always bring comfort to those who asked. To modern ears, all this can sound like fear, a world where nothing is in your hands. To the Greeks, it sounded like clarity. You could not control the length of your thread, you could not keep the shears from closing. But you could decide how you would walk from one end of the thread to the other. Hector knew he would die under Troy's walls and kissed his wife and child goodbye before he put on his armor anyway. Achilles knew that if he sailed to Troy his life would be short and his name long, and if he stayed home he would grow old and be forgotten. He chose the short, bright path and lived it fully. Oedipus tried to escape his prophecy and crashed straight into it, but when the truth finally stood in front of him, he did not look away. These stories are not about people who won against destiny. They are about people who stood upright inside it. Even the gods, for all their power, watched the loom of the fates with a kind of uneasy respect. And somewhere in the smoke of Delphi, in the rustle of Dodona's leaves, in the hush that falls before battle, there was always that same soft idea. You cannot choose what will happen. You can choose how you meet it. And so, as you lie here listening to stories older than kingdoms, older than the languages that first carried them, you are doing what the Greeks themselves did on long, dark nights. Remembering gods and heroes, kings and killers, lovers and liars, all of them have walked their threads to the end. What remains now are the tales, the echoes, the quiet realization that even in a world of thunderbolts and prophecies, the small human act of facing what comes with open eyes might be the greatest power of all. And to the ancient Greeks, death was not a door slammed shut. It was a breath that stopped and a story that moved quietly underground. They did not picture heaven above and hell below the way later faiths would. Instead, they imagined a single vast country of the dead stretching beneath the earth, where kings and beggars, heroes and cowards all walked the same dim paths. They called this realm Hades after the god who ruled it. They almost never said his name out loud. It felt dangerous, like knocking on a locked door at midnight, so they called him Plauton instead, the wealthy one, because every vein of metal, every buried treasure, every body laid in the ground belonged in the end to him. The entrance to this world was not a single gate, but a landscape marked by rivers that did not behave like rivers on the surface. There was Styx, the dark water of hatred and unbreakable oaths. Acheron, the river of sorrow. The Phlegethon that burned and flowed with fire. Cocytus, whose very name meant wailing. And Lethe, the soft, terrible current of forgetting. Each one was more than just water. They were boundaries inside the soul, between memory and loss, between anger and peace, between holding on and letting go. The dead arrived as shadows, thin and colorless, their old warmth drained away. They came to the banks of Acheron and met Charon, the ferryman with the patient hands and the unreadable face. For a single coin, he would take them across in his small, steady boat. Those who were buried without proper rites, without a coin, without care, had to wait wandering the far shore for 100 years, murmuring like wind through reeds. On the far side stood Cerberus, 3 heads, 1 body, a dog so fearsome that his job was not to keep people out but to make sure no one ever left. Past him spread the wide fields of asphodel, gray and soft and endless. Here most souls drifted, not screaming, not rejoicing, simply existing, their memories fading like old ink, their voices rustling like dry grass. But not everyone had the same ending. 3 judges waited in the deep, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. They listened, weighed, remembered. Those whose lives had been full of betrayal, deliberate cruelty, broken oaths, were sent down further still into Tartarus. Their punishment was not random. It matched the shape of the crime. Sisyphus, who had tricked gods and men, was forced to push his heavy stone uphill forever, only to watch it roll down again and again. Tantalus, who had insulted the gods at their own table, stood in a pool of water beneath branches heavy with fruit. Every time he reached for a drink, the water slipped away. Every time he reached for food, the branches pulled back. Hunger and thirst without relief. Ixion, who had tried to seduce Hera herself, was strapped to a burning wheel that never stopped turning. The few truly blessed, those rare souls whose lives were both brave and just, went outward instead of down to the Elysian fields. There the air was always gentle. Grass stayed green, time walked slowly. Heroes could rest without their stories being stripped away. Some beliefs said that after long ages, a soul could choose to return to step into the river Lethe, drink forgetfulness, and be born again without memory. Mystery religions later whispered that a small number might escape the cycle entirely and rise to the stars. But for most, the underworld was not a place of reward or torture. It was simply the final shape of existence, quiet, ordered, unchanging. At its center sat Hades himself. He was not a devil, he did not tempt, did not twist or bribe. He did not command armies on the surface or make storms at sea. He was a king who stayed where he belonged and kept his realm in balance. Immovable, unyielding, necessary. His queen, Persephone, brought something softer and stranger into that darkness. She had not chosen her throne at first. She was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain and green fields, a springtime girl who loved flowers and bright air. One day, while she was picking blossoms, the ground opened like a wound. Hades rose in his chariot, reached for her, and the earth closed again above them both. Demeter searched the world, calling her name. When no answer came, her grief sank into the soil. Crops failed, trees stopped bearing fruit, the air grew thin, famine walked from village to village, prayers rose, but Demeter would not listen. Until her daughter was returned, the world would remain in mourning. Zeus, seeing humanity on the edge of extinction, sent Hermes to bargain. Persephone could come back, he decreed, but the underworld has rules as binding as the sky. She had tasted its food, a few seeds of a pomegranate, bright and red as drops of blood. That tiny act bound a part of her to Hades' realm, so a bargain was made. A part of the year she would sit beside Hades as queen, the underworld calm beneath her gaze. Part of the year she would return to Demeter, and the world would feel her footsteps as spring and summer. When she descended, Demeter grieved. Leaves fell. The air cooled. When she rose again, flowers opened and life pushed through the soil. Death became not just an ending, but half of a cycle. Over time, Persephone changed in the minds of those who worshipped her. She was no longer only a stolen girl. She was a ruler in her own right, a figure of quiet power who could move between darkness and light. In the Eleusinian mysteries, secret rituals held near Athens, people reenacted her descent and return under cover of night. They did not speak openly of what they saw or felt there, but the promise tied to those rites was simple and deep. Just as grain can be buried and rise again, so might the soul find some kind of renewal beyond the grave. The underworld was not entirely cut off from the living world above. A few brave or desperate souls found their way down and back. Orpheus, whose music could make stones weep, walked into Hades with nothing but his lyre. He sang so beautifully that even the stern king and soft-faced queen agreed to let his wife, Eurydice, return on one condition. He must walk ahead of her and never look back until they reached the light. At the last moment, fear and love turned him around. She vanished and the deal dissolved like mist. Heracles came, muscles and will unshaken, and wrestled Cerberus into submission, dragging him briefly to the surface and then returning him to his post. Odysseus, following Circe's instructions, stood at the edge of the world, poured blood into a dark pit, and called the dead to drink. They came, Tiresias the prophet, Achilles, Agamemnon. Achilles, once the greatest warrior among the living, told him bluntly that he would rather serve as the lowest slave on earth than reign over all the shades. For the Greeks, that line meant something simple and heavy. Death is real. It is not glorious. It is not meant to be chaste. But it is part of the order of things, so they buried their dead carefully. They placed coins under tongues or on eyes for Charon's fee. They laid out weapons for warriors, jewelry and small comforts for others. They poured wine onto the ground and burned offerings at hearth and grave. They spoke to those who had gone as if they still listened, because in dreams, in small signs, sometimes they seemed to. The underworld was a reflection of their deepest beliefs. Justice without appeal, silence without cruelty, a vast realm where everyone eventually walked, whether they were ready or not. It wasn't heaven. It wasn't hell. It was simply the last country, ruled by a god who asked for no praise and promised no escape. But even that god and all his brothers and sisters above would learn what it felt like to fade. Not in their own world, but in ours. Gods do not die the way people do. They don't fall over, turn to dust, and vanish. They thin out in a different way, slipping from daily prayers into stories, from stories into symbols, from symbols into faint, half-remembered shapes. For the Olympians, this long fading began when Rome took the stage. The Romans looked at the Greek gods and saw something they recognized: a powerful family of divine rulers, perfect for an empire that liked order. They did not burn Olympus down, they translated it. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Poseidon became Neptune, Athena became Minerva, Dionysus became Bacchus. Same stories, new clothing. Jupiter did not rule from a wild mountain peak so much as from the Capitoline Hill, like a judge seated over a capital city. The wild frenzy of Dionysus softened into the more polished image of banquets and wine. Athena's sharp, independent edge turned into Minerva's calm, civic wisdom, the mind of the city, not the shout on the battlefield. Writers like Ovid took the old Greek tales and told them again in Latin in the Metamorphoses, beautiful, clever, a little distant. Virgil, in the Aeneid, used the gods to push Aeneas toward the founding of Rome itself. The gods were still there, but they were beginning to feel less like unpredictable neighbors and more like characters in a grand story about Rome's destiny. They became ideas as much as presences. Meanwhile, the empire was filling up with other gods. Soldiers whispered the name of Mithras, who was born from stone and killed a cosmic bull in a cave, a god for men who fought and bled underground. From Egypt came Isis, a goddess of magic, grief, and rebirth wrapped in linen and mystery. From Judea came something different still: a single, invisible God who allowed no statues, no carved images, no divine siblings, no thunder-wielding rivals. This God did not sit among many. He stood alone. These new faiths did not just compete with Zeus and his court. They challenged the whole idea of a crowded heaven full of flawed immortals. They offered something the old myths rarely promised clearly: one ultimate truth, one moral path, one final salvation. At the same time, Greek and Roman thinkers were questioning things from the inside. Xenophanes joked bitterly that if horses could paint their gods, they'd paint them as horses. He was pointing out the obvious. The Olympians looked suspiciously like beautiful, immortal human beings with the volume turned up. Plato loved myth, but he didn't like the idea that the gods could be petty or cruel. If they were truly divine, he argued, they must be perfectly good, which meant the old stories couldn't be quite right. Epicurus went further. Yes, the gods exist, he said, but they are too lofty to care what you or I do. Fear of divine punishment was a chain people needed to break. The Stoics saw divinity not as a person, but as a kind of cosmic reason, the logos that shaped all things, a calm intelligence that underlay the universe. Bit by bit, the thunderbolts turned into metaphors. By the time the imperial cult arrived, with emperors themselves declared divine, the line between sacred and political was almost gone. Altars stood for Caesar. The sacrifices were made to living men. The old gods watched their images echoed in new mortal faces. And then came a faith that would eventually sweep the empire. Christianity did not look like much at first, a small, persecuted movement centered on a single god and a single suffering figure on a cross. There were no myths about him chasing nymphs or winning chariot races. His story was about injustice, sacrifice, resurrection, and a promise of life after death for anyone, not just heroes. Slowly, quietly, the new faith spread through households, through markets, through prisons and palaces. Its god had no statue, no marble face. Its worship happened in small rooms with whispered prayers and shared bread. Over time, its churches replaced the old temples. Its songs replaced hymns to Apollo. Its scriptures called the old Olympians idols at best, demons at worst. Under Emperor Theodosius I, the laws finally caught up with belief. The pagan sacrifices were outlawed. Temples were closed or repurposed. Even the Olympic Games, once held in honor of Zeus, were abolished. There was no great final battle in the sky. No scene where Zeus raises his lightning against a new god and loses. Instead, the old gods slipped into silence. Their statues stayed where they were, but no one brought offerings. Their altars stood empty. Rain and time softened their sharp features. Ivy climbed their flanks. Though the stories did not die, they changed shape again. People read about Heracles in scrolls and books, not in sanctuary walls. Artists painted Athena on ceilings without expecting her protection in war. The gods became characters, not rulers. And yet, in that new form, they proved almost indestructible. They came back during the Renaissance, draped in new colors and fresh paint. Philosophers and poets picked up their names and faces again. Modern writers still retell their myths with new angles, new questions. The Greeks gave their gods very human hearts, jealous, loving, wounded, proud. And because of that, even when no one believes Zeus is sitting on a real mountain waiting to throw real lightning, people still remember his name, still feel something when they hear it. The temples are ruins, the altars cold. But in the minds of those who listen at night, in the quiet when a story is told of heroes and gods and the long, strange ages before our own Olympus is still there, somewhere above the clouds, waiting in memory, lit by a fire that never quite goes out. As though the temples crumbled and the oracles fell quiet, the stories of Olympus did not vanish. They drifted through time like faint music carried by wind, fading, returning, reshaping themselves in the minds of anyone who paused long enough to listen. Empires rose, kingdoms burned, and languages changed, but the myth has always refused to die. Even during the long centuries when Christianity covered Europe like a new sky, the Greek gods never disappeared. They were no longer worshipped, but they were never forgotten. Monks, sitting beneath dim lamps in stone rooms, copied ancient manuscripts with reluctant hands, writing Homer's verses and Hesiod's lines even as they spoke against the beliefs those words once held. Books kept the stories breathing, tucked away between sermons and scrolls, waiting for the world to remember. And eventually, the world did. The Renaissance began, an age when the minds of Europe turned backward to move forward. Artists, poets, and scholars opened those old texts again, and the gods rose with the turning of every page. Not as beings of thunder and miracles, but as symbols, reflections of human beauty, ambition, jealousy, longing. The painters lifted Aphrodite from the sea in waves of pale color. Sculptors carved Apollo in marble that almost seemed warm. Poets called on the muses once more, and myth stepped back into the light, not through temples but through artistry. Then the Enlightenment came, and reason challenged superstition, but even reason could not erase myth. To Voltaire, the stories were clever symbols. To Goethe, they were mirrors of the human soul. And when the Romantic era arrived, the gods returned again, this time wrapped in emotion, tragedy, and longing. Writers revisited Oedipus, Antigone, Orpheus, Eurydice, not as distant legends but as living questions. What does fate mean? What does love cost? How far will a person go to defy destiny? Time moved forward, but the myths moved with it. Modern stories carried their echoes. Carl Jung saw Zeus and Athena in the human mind. James Joyce wove Odysseus through the streets of Dublin. Rick Riordan guided new generations to Olympus through Manhattan skyscrapers. Movies and comics dressed the gods in new clothes, but the names were still the same: Apollo, Artemis, Hera, Hermes, Athena. Even as the world changed, the old stories stayed. Because myth is not a fixed thing. It is a living memory. It grows with the people who carry it. What the Greeks created was more than a pantheon. They built a language for the human condition, one that could explain fear and beauty, hope and grief, pride and downfall. Their gods were flawed, yes, but gloriously flawed. In their imperfections, people found truths. Still today, in a world of satellites and science, something ancient whispers beneath everything. You can hear it in every tale of chosen heroes, in tragedies that feel older than memory, in the seasons turning on their endless wheel. A girl disappears into darkness and returns with the spring. A king defies a prophecy and loses everything. A warrior chooses glory even when he knows it will end his life. The faces of the characters change over time, but the bones of the stories never do. The gods may have stepped away from Olympus, but they never left humanity. Now they walk quietly, in books, in songs, in dreams, slipping through the cracks of imagination like warm embers in a cooling fire. They survive in every story that dares to reach beyond the ordinary. They are not dead, they have simply moved. And so our journey ends here. The winds around Mount Olympus have grown cold. The torches in Delphi have turned to ash. But the myths remain, alive in every mind that remembers, every voice that retells, and every dream shaped by ancient echoes. Good night. Let the old gods watch over your sleep.